Thank you so much for the invitation to be able to be with you today and to share some of my own journey and the work that I've been involved in around this topic of inclusion and what it means for reaching all children. Now, it's a great honor for me to be here, and I'm looking around the room and wondering how many of you are thinking, that's not a Scottish accent. I am a dual national. I was born in the US, and I did my initial teacher education and my early years of teaching in early years in the US before I married a Brit and moved to the UK a lifetime ago. So I have had a long career in Europe, predominantly in the UK, but as Maggie mentioned, also working with some international organizations. And I am here today to share a little bit about the things that I have learned from the work that I've been involved with along the way. My own research interest began, when I was very, very young, when I was a student and I was working with children with what we say in Scotland, additional support needs, or children with disabilities. And I had this observation that the conventional wisdom at the time, and I'm going back to the 1970s now, although I still think there's a little bit of what I'm going to say is with us today, that there was this idea that different kinds of children needed different kinds of provision, and that we had to match interventions to characteristics of the children that were thought to interfere or impede their learning. And my observation from working in those settings was actually that didn't really seem to hold true, because the kinds of children that were in the kinds of settings I was working in were all very different from each other. And so I started out with a really critical think about some of the theoretical ideas that were driving the field, and that has always been, my own research and the work I've done has always been rooted in questions of, well, why is it like this, and why is it that some teachers can do what other teachers say is not possible to do, or like why do we have so much variability in our practice? And what is it that we can learn from that? And how can we use that learning to inform the preparation of teachers or to help us improve practice? Thank you very much. What I'd like to do in starting, and here we go. Okay, thank you for this, Sean, is just start to unpack a little bit the term inclusive education, in part because I'm sure each one of you have your own definition of what that is in your mind. And I want to take just a moment to unravel a little bit so that what follows in my talk today will make sense to you. It's a complicated term, and it means different things at different levels within our system, but also within different national systems of education. And I have always found it helpful to unpack that a little bit, and I like to differentiate between inclusive education, inclusive practice, and inclusive pedagogy. So inclusive education is when we think about inclusion writ large. And there's a very well-known broad definition that talks about inclusion as increasing participation and decreasing exclusion from the kinds of opportunities that are available broadly to most children. And you'll hear as I go on this theme that I have about thinking in terms of everyone and thinking in terms of most children and some children. But inclusive education, we think about increasing the participation of everyone, reducing exclusion for everyone. And then what that means when we translate that into practice are the doings. And I think of inclusive practice as doings, and I make that point in part because my own experience, and probably yours too, is that wherever we go in the world, or even within our national systems, we see all kinds of things that are being done in the name of inclusive education. And some of them, in my view, meet a standard of inclusion and others don't. And yet we call it inclusive education. So sometimes it's doing nothing because we're treating everyone the same. That's inclusive. I've heard that called inclusive education. We don't want to single anyone out. And yet we're overlooking important differences that do need our attention. So when and I will come on to this in more detail as we go along, talk about specific pedagogy, it is not just a practice, it's a specific way of working. And I use the term pedagogy based on Robin Alexander's idea of pedagogy as the act and discourse of teaching. So as we will see, and as we go along, this is really developed from a very detailed, specific look at the practices of teachers who seem to be able to do well in multiple and varied contexts. And when we started this work on inclusive education, it was about access to education, to all forms of education, but around the idea that of children being educated in a unified system. And the original concern was with students with disabilities. So students with disabilities, as I'm sure you all know, are the most excluded group in every national system of education. So although the sets of children or groups of children that may have greater or lesser access to education within any system, it varies across regions of the world, but for children with disabilities, they have experienced the most discrimination and the most exclusion. And often it would be a legal exclusion. There might be compulsory education for everyone except for children with disabilities who would not be seen as educable. That's a historical legacy, but again, one that is still with us in many ways. But over time, that idea about all children being educated together in a unified system has now become a broad concept that encompasses anyone who might be excluded or have limited access to an education system within a country. And so what we have today in terms of our policy recommendations is a European Council recommendation that talks about high-quality inclusive education in Europe, promoted through measures to empower teachers, school leaders, and academic staff, helping them convey common values, promote active citizenship, while transmitting a sense of belonging and responding to the diverse needs of all learners. This is also linked to the Council recommendation on high-quality early childhood education and care, where the call is for systems that encourage participation, strengthen social inclusion, and embrace social diversity. So very much aligned with the themes of the conference today. And the task, as I see it, is to empower teachers and care staff to convey those common values, foster belonging among diverse groups of learners. And so what I'd like to do in the heart of my talk today is focus on 3 areas that I think are interrelated and help us to, again, bring some clarity to what is a very complex and complicated a way of thinking about providing for everyone. And the first is I want to just spend a few minutes reviewing the policy context and the historical legacy, what I call the inheritance that we're all working with in various ways. I want to consider the role of specialist support in the context of inclusion and encourage us to think together, but to ask ourselves how thinking differently opens up new possibilities for practice. And I have more to say about that a little later on this morning. So let's start in Europe. It's a good site for this discussion on inclusion. This conference, Zlata has told me we've got over 700 delegates from 54 countries. So we know, and I think as Maggie said, we're beyond Europe now. We're looking, more broadly. But what we have in terms of Europe as a site is this idea of harmonization and integration across countries, which has been a theme, and I think will be all well known to this audience, this idea of unity in diversity. It's been part of the European, common values, way of thinking since the end of the Second World War when the Council of Europe was formed. But today, the changing demographics of schooling, that are the result of the forces of globalization and migration, and all of the things that Maggie listed in her introduction have brought a new emphasis on what we mean when we talk about harmonization and integration. And there are huge implications, I think, for practice, for professional development, but also for research. And one of the arguments I will make to the researchers in the room is that, again, thinking differently about how we do our work opens up new possibilities for generating knowledge. And new knowledge, I think, is needed now more than ever. So we've got an ecosystem now within which we do this work, where, at our macro level, we've got the supranational organizations like the EU, pan-European way of thinking, harmonizing, promoting common values. We've got the international NGOs, the UNICEF, UNESCO, the bodies of the United Nations, again, really trying to bring a common language, a common framework, promote common values around concepts of inclusion, social justice, diversity. But then we move on to an understanding that all of this is regulated by nation states. And so, again, at that macro level, there is the kind of the panopticon, for lack of a better word, way of looking at all of this. But then we've got the education is within the jurisdiction of countries. And so immediately we have, very specific ways of thinking and regulating what some of these broader concepts might mean. And within those nation states, we've got municipalities, we've got cantons, we've got, the regional distinctions around how those policies that are set and regulated at national levels are implemented. And then, of course, local communities where, the practical work gets done. And I think we've got then attached to that and associated with that, and for our purposes today at the most micro level, we are looking at what, and I've got this in my notes in inverted commas because I don't like the word, but how we prepare or, facilitate the development of young children for the societies that they'll be going into, and that's generally by preparing them to enter school, but with a view towards what kinds of citizens, do we want to, do we want these children to become? And those are important questions, but they take place, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, within a historical legacy that I would just like to dwell on for a couple of minutes, because I think, as sometimes I ask myself, have we really moved from the 20th century into the 21st century? And when I say that, what I'm thinking about is this idea about compulsory education. Compulsory schooling is a 20th century idea. That really was about broadening access to education for everyone as a way of participating, as a development. Education became to be seen as a human right in and of itself, but it was also thought of as a development right, as, a means and access and a mechanism for achieving other things, including social cohesion. But the way that this was implemented at the beginning of the 20th century, where there were some elitist forms of schooling did exist for some children, the expansion of education led to a whole lot of thinking that was based on 19th and early 20th century thinking about classification, sorting, organizing ourselves in ways that enabled a broadening participation, but did so by differentiating different kinds of options for different kinds of learners. That is a very, very deep historical legacy that reverberates to this day. We talk about inclusive education, and we can argue where and when that all started, but for our purposes today, with an international audience, I'd like to talk about the Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action, which was a conference on special educational needs that was held in 1994. It was a world conference. It followed the 1990 conference on education for all, which launched that IFA movement. So again, towards the end of the 20th century. But because children with disabilities were excluded from consideration at that conference, another separate conference came along a couple of years later. And that's where this idea of challenging this in a way, kind of apartheid idea of separate but equal really came to the fore in international circles. So we've got this challenge to the status quo. We've got the historical legacy that comes from the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. The logo for that is on the other side of the screen. That came about in 2006. It's a UN convention that talks about the rights of people with disabilities writ large, but Article 24 talks specifically about education. And I'll have more to say about that in a minute. But over time, in 2015, when the Education for All goals, or the Millennium Development Goals, were replaced with the Sustainable Development Goals that we all have some adherence to now, greater or lesser depending on different regions and contexts, we talk about inclusive education for everybody. So that idea now has been taken from the original conversations within a special needs discourse to something much broader. We talk about inclusive and equitable education for each and every learner. That has been a change. So what I want to argue and ask you to think about with me over the course of this conference is the extent to which old ideas are still driving our practice while new ideas are being overlaid on that, and the tensions that that creates, and then how we navigate that as practitioners, as teacher educators, and as researchers. So the Salamanca Statement, as I mentioned, followed the EFA agenda that was set because it did not consider disability. And what that did, it challenged the idea that some children do not belong in regular or mainstream schools. It called into question the structures of schooling that rely on different forms of provision for different types of learners. And it introduced the idea of inclusive education to the wider education community. Very important, 30 years old now, but still, a lot of reference to the work that has done for us. Article 24 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is quite interesting because what we see in part of that article is the language of inclusion. It's anti-discrimination language. It talks about children with disabilities not being excluded from the general education or mainstream education system because of a disability. It talks about inclusive access to an inclusive, quality primary education and secondary education on an equal basis, so that equity agenda is being raised at the same time. But here's where, for me, the tension comes in. The language of special education, the 20th century language of special education, which talks about different kinds of interventions, different kinds of provisions for different learners, is also there. The focus, and it's not that there aren't important differences, because there are, and they do need us to attend to them, and I have more to say about that in a minute. But what we've done historically is only focus on the individual difference, which becomes the pathology of the child, instead of thinking about difference as just an ordinary aspect of human development. We're all different from each other. And so we've got this focus on individual differences. So the language of inclusion disrupts the status quo, but it combines, it intersects with that historical legacy, and that's why I think practice is complex, and that's why there are lots of debates around inclusion and what it is, and it's contested, and people argue about the definition, and it's a little bit, for me, kind of a feedback loop. It just goes around, and it's not helping us make progress in terms of improving the quality of life for children. So I think it's important to unpack that. In terms of just change over time, we now, under the Sustainable Development Goals, we talk about vulnerable children. And of course, persons with disabilities, for reasons that I mentioned earlier, are first on the list. We have again, this is a European list of those in vulnerable situations: persons with disabilities, Indigenous people, those in remote rural areas, ethnic minorities, the poor, women and girls, migrants, refugees, and displaced persons, whether as a result of conflict or natural disaster. So this is what we talk about when we talk about inclusive education at the macro level. And where, again, we get into, the variation in terms of what's happening is when we ask who is vulnerable within each national jurisdiction. And we get different answers to that question as we go. So our future is to ensure inclusive and quality education, promote lifelong learning for everyone. And we've got a challenge of meeting inclusive education for everyone, in part, I think, for what I call a trilemma. Trilemma is when you've got three options and they're all problematic. So in terms of where we are today in our field, I think we're talking about questions like everybody all together all the time. Is that feasible? Is that realistic? Each one of you will have an answer to that question right now in your own mind based on your own practice. What can be done? What are the barriers? What are the limitations? Second option, differentiated options for different types of learners. Well, I started this talk with the argument that that doesn't really hold up in practice. Again, very problematic. We've got the option of everybody together for much of the time with differentiated options for some. And what that raises is a dilemma of difference, where you're responding to an individual difference, but you're doing it in a way that calls attention to it as a problem. I'll come back to that one in a minute. But it also takes us to the question about what is the role of specialist support, and how do we find specialist support? I often use examples from special needs education because I did my initial training there, but most of what I have to say, I think, would be just as relevant if we substituted bilingual education, refugee education, urban education, any of the other so-called specialisms or silos that the work that we do operates within. So we'll just use the term specialist support, but I mean it in a writ large kind of way. The first one that comes up for me is this question about special and/or inclusive education. And again, in my own work, we see, and I see this a lot at national levels, we've got broad definition of inclusion on the one hand, and then we've got it's another name for special ed. And a lot of jurisdictions will have just renamed special education practice or special needs education practice inclusive education. So now children go to the inclusion program, the inclusion school, the inclusion class, but nothing has changed. Practice is still the same. And then we have my own notion of inclusive pedagogy, which I'll have more to say about in a moment, but there's the question about whether that's the same or different. And people will say, well, you're just talking about good teaching. And I'm going to argue in a moment that I'm not talking about simple good teaching, if there was such a thing as simple good teaching, but it's something quite specific. Although very often people talk about inclusive pedagogies, plural, I do not, and they mean interventions. They mean things that we do to respond to individual differences. So again, we're back to where we started. And then we have this idea of teacher education and professional development. And that's where, again, for myself, and I am really, this is a little bit anecdotal in that my own teaching in universities was always in working with within special education departments until I moved to Scotland. And then the brief in the project that Martin Rouse and I moved to Scotland to work on was to make sure that mainstream classroom teachers were better prepared to deal with more diverse student populations. It was about taking inclusion based on the arguments we were making about how do we respond to individual differences among learners in ways that are inclusive, equitable, et cetera, but take that training and knowledge into mainstream education. And that was a real eye-opener for me, because I realized the silo I had been working in terms of the traditions of how research was done, how knowledge was generated, all of those kinds of things. And all of that got challenged and turned upside down, because in primary and secondary education, different theoretical ideas prevailed. So how do you take this knowledge into the training that happens in those areas? And in so doing, do we break down some of those barriers that we encounter when specialists and class teachers find it so difficult to speak each other's language and work together? So who gets to determine the knowledge, and where does it sit within professional learning activities is an important question. And the work is hard, and it's hard to answer the questions I just asked, for a couple of reasons. Because we have so much variability in practice, as I just mentioned. It's hard for us to know what constitutes good practice, because again, we have different ideas of what the criteria should be. And I know one of the projects I was involved in worked with the inspectorate in England, where the inspectors wanted to know, how do we know it when we see it? How should we judge the practices that we're observing in classrooms? And that led to real questions about what counts as evidence. How do we know, and that's not just about how do we know it when we see it, but how do we know if we're successful? And I'm going to jump ahead and give you a little bit of a hint here on that one, because the hint is everybody gains. Okay, so we're not just talking about individuals now, we're talking about everybody. And we know we're successful when there's good outcomes for everyone. So let me just now pause there, and I want to just go back to some of what I'm calling these culprits here. The variability question. And when we talk about everybody gains, or we talk about variability in practice, I have been talking about it up till now in terms of different kinds of provision for different kinds of learners. But what happens within that provision is also equally important. And this slide, I hope you can read it. It's the first time I'm using it. It's not mine. It was developed by parents in a school in Scotland, and they were working collaboratively with the staff, and they were wanting to collaboratively develop inclusive practice. And one of the things they did in their conversations with the staff was to talk about what was helpful and not helpful within the service that everyone was trying to work together to improve. And so what you see here are the parents reminding the staff of some of the things that they do. And we all do these things, myself included, and we have to work really hard to avoid making judgments about the families that we're working with, about the children that are in front of us, bringing our own assumptions about children and their learning into the classroom, drawing on some of the beliefs that we hold that may be faith-based or scientific knowledge that through our professional learning, and blaming parents. That's the right-hand side of this slide, where parents are saying, when these things happen within provision, you may have a provision that's seen on the surface as to be, quite exemplary, a gold star service, but the parents and the children, the families who may be experiencing that provision in ways that are not helpful to them. And they tell us very, very clearly on the other side of the slide about the kinds of things that they need and want from us as professionals. They want to feel empowered. They want to feel validated when they share with you their own feelings of distress or worry, concern about their children. They don't want to be told, "Oh well," or "That's not my job." They want to be met with compassion. And I know we all like to think of ourselves that way, and I probably think that most people are most of the time, but I'm also very aware that we all tend to sometimes, in the busy mix of our daily professional lives, maybe we're not always as compassionate as we might be, and sometimes it's important to let other people point out to us that there's scope for improvement in that area. And they want us to share their knowledge with them. They want to feel educated. So it's really important, I think, that we ask ourselves questions about, are we being helpful? Are we being helpful? We might have exemplary practice based on all the best evidence-based research, et cetera, but how helpful is it? Very important, and I'm very grateful to the parents who were happy to share that slide with me. So I've talked a little bit about within service variability, but we also have the dilemma of difference. And I mentioned to you that's when specialist support reinforces the problem it's trying to solve. Very well known, and you may have seen this cartoon before. It's also very well known, where you've got an inclusive school. And the school's inclusive because there's a ramp around the back, so if you're in a wheelchair or you have a mobility difficulty, you can use the ramp. But the stairs are in the front, so everyone is welcome, but you're welcome in a way that if you're different, you're marginalized just by virtue of putting the ramp in the back instead of replacing the stair or having a ramp next to the stair. I worked in a school once that was very proud of its accessibility because they had installed a lift, but then they only let children with disabilities use the lift. So again, they had the lift, but you really stuck out when you used that lift because only some people could use it. So we have the dilemma of difference, and we have to ask questions about whether, if our practice is reinforcing the dilemma of difference, can we call it inclusive? And we see this in our classrooms when the work that we set for students, based on some of the ideas that I mentioned earlier that we all have about ability, the way children are grouped, classified, et cetera. But when we set work and tasks for children rooted in that kind of thinking, we differentiate the work, fair enough. We do need to do that. I'm not arguing against that, but I'm saying we do it in ways that repeat the repetition of exclusion within the classroom. And I'm willing to bet that most of you can think of examples of where you've seen that, or maybe even where you've, in an unwitting way, done that, where you've used an ability grouping strategy, or you've organized children in such a way that that the interactions that you think you're encouraging amongst everybody are only occurring within particular subsets of children. Those are some of the legacies of 20th century thinking that are still with us, and the biggest one of all is the bell curve and bell curve thinking. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the bell curve because I think we all know what that is. But I want to point out that this is a way of organizing the complex world of teaching in light of that implementation of compulsory schooling, the first idea about education being for everyone, that we need it in order to encourage participation in society, that 20th century thinking. It served a really useful purpose. It really did allow for the expansion of education in ways that were unprecedented. And it's become normalized in our practice. It's taken for granted. We hardly ever think about it anymore, even though it still underpins many of our policies, our ways of thinking, decisions that we make about differentiated options for learners and how those should be delivered. And as the philosopher Martha Nussbaum points out, why do we conflate a moral judgment about good with statistical frequency? So when you look at what's normal in the bell curve, we make a judgment that that's good because that works for most children. And there is that argument that no matter what you do, it's going to work for most children, and then depending on what you do, it won't work for some. And that's been okay with us for a century, that it is okay, it's the price we pay because we can always do something different or additional for those few some who need something additional, and that's the definition basically of special needs education, that which is additional or different to what is provided to others of similar age. It's problematic because the naturalization of the bell curve as a structural feature of schooling is inherently unjust. It perpetuates the inevitability of failure. 50% of learners, or almost 50% of learners, have to be below average by definition. That's a problem. But as a colleague of mine from Cambridge used to say, but we need the bell curve from the point of view of the organizational work that it does in the complex world of teaching. It's problematic, but what replaces it? That's the question she asks in her work. What replaces it? So our challenge is, and this is the challenge to the trilemma, which comes about as a result of this kind of thinking, is how do we respond to individual differences between learners and learner groups within forms of provision that are structured in ways that perpetuate failure, and yet at the same time they aim to convey common values, promote active citizenship, transmit a sense of belonging, etc. That's the slide I read to you in the beginning. It's like, no wonder why this is so hard. And how do we do this when practitioners today are dealing with more diverse groups than ever before, and they don't often feel adequately prepared for the job? And so, we cannot do, no one can do this work alone. And there is, I do think that sense of helplessness that practitioners often feel as a result of increasing diversity and all of the other changes. I know, in the UK, we've seen some real, pushbacks and rescissions in terms of the resources that are available to do this kind of work. It puts pressure on teachers in schools. And, one of the natural outcomes of that is people feel like they can't do it, or they can't work with particular sets or groups of children. So, my answer, and I want to really move on now in the last bit of this to talk about what do we do? Where do we go from here? And what do we do with all of this? And my answer in terms of my research goes right back to the beginning of this talk is, why can some people do what others say is impossible, and what can we learn from them? And so a lot of the research that goes into what I call inclusive pedagogy has come from studying teachers' craft knowledge. And that's using Donald McIntyre's definition of craft knowledge as the tacit, schematic, intuitive thinking on which classroom teaching depends. And of course, when I say classroom, I'm also referring to early years settings when I say this. He says that the knowledge that teachers develop through the process of reflection, practical problem solving that they engage in to carry out the demands of their jobs. This knowledge is informed by each teacher's individual way of thinking and knowing. And Donald was a mentor of mine. I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to work with him, because one of the things he pointed out to me as a young researcher was that teachers don't find knowledge generated by researchers very helpful or useful because they're not engaging with the complexity of the context in which teachers do their work, and that researchers were missing. It wasn't that practitioners in that close the gap, theory-practice gap, and I've written about this recently, actually, last year in the British Educational Research Association magazine, this sense that of people still focusing on why can't practitioners use research more effectively. Donald used to say, why can't researchers design research that's more useful to practitioners? Okay, so you're welcome. But that has truly, that's the question about, can thinking differently open up new possibilities for practice? That's what it's all about. And that's the research that we have done that has led to inclusive pedagogy. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to go through these next slides really quickly, these next 3 slides really, really quickly. But all of this is really well documented in the literature. I'm happy to make references available. A lot of this is in the public domain, so it's very easy to find. But so what we did was, we found through expert nominations teachers who had reputations for being really good at working with difficult children in mainstream schools, diverse groups of learners, et cetera. And we spent time with them trying to understand and trying to get them to explain to us what they were doing. And when Donald talked about that tacit knowledge of teachers, what he was basically saying is that not enough attention has been paid to theorizing that in a way that is accessible to others. So teachers always apologize about sounding woolly. And it's not that they're woolly, it's that we haven't found the language to really make their work more visible. And that really also really motivated us in this study. So what we found in the studies that we did is that what these teachers had seemed to have done was turn tradition on its head. They had shifted their focus away from differences among learners to teaching for all children. They stopped thinking about and kind of really worrying about some children. They really thought about all the children in their class and as everybody. And they knew that they might have to get additional support along the way from people that had more expertise than they did about a particular impairment or a language problem or an emotional behavioral difficulty, et cetera. But they still saw those children as their responsibility. They had rejected bell curve thinking about ability as fixed and the idea that the presence of some children hold back the progress of others. And that is often the biggest barrier to inclusion. Oh, we can't have these children because it'll interfere with the education of other children. The teachers in our studies, they were way beyond that in their practice. And part of how they did that, and now I'm going again to link what we saw them do to some of Susan Hart's work in her book, Learning Without Limits, where she talks about teachers as having suspended their judgment about ability. They weren't thinking in terms of ability, they were just thinking in terms of learning. They also trusted the children, and this kind of links to again, I might be dating myself now, but Jerome Bruner's idea that anybody can learn anything if the conditions are right. That the possibility for learning is open-ended, it's not fixed, that you have to start where the child is. And the third thing that goes back again to the Learning Without Limits work is that and I know we're really good at this in early years, much better than in the school years, but let children surprise us with our learning. If we suspend our judgment about what they can and cannot do, and we trust them, then they will surprise us in demonstrating to us things that we didn't know it was possible for them to do. That's where the work starts. That's where the work of teaching and learning really starts. But it's hard to get there within that structure that I hopefully forcefully described to you. That's why it's difficult for us, but it's also why we need conferences like this and why we should never give up on the work. So differences in learning are challenges for teaching, not problems in children. But we need to work collaboratively to share our experiences and learn from each other. Those were basically, kind of like when we did the qualitative data analysis and all of that, that's kind of what came out of that. And what we then did was theorize that, and that's inclusive pedagogy, which is that specific way of thinking and working where we have learned from practice, where we talk about difference as something to be expected. We're replacing bell curve thinking about ability as fixed, and you slot in here depending on what it is that we're doing or who you are. And we replace that with a conceptualization of learning as open-ended, and we reconceptualize differences between learners as opportunities for teaching. And so this is a little bit repetitive. We're concerned with the learning for everyone, not most or some. We are not asking what questions, but how to. And again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that now, but I always argue in the professional development work I do, it's not what you do, it is how you do it that matters. You can take a practice that's recommended in the literature, an evidence-based practice, and really mess it up if you implement it in a way that makes children feel stigmatized, marginalized, or othered somehow, or where it's so it's so differentiated from what everyone else is doing that you've got that repetition of exclusion in your classroom. So it's not the what, it's the how. And we cannot do this work alone. Working with others, is just essential to taking the work forward. So when we talk about differences are an ordinary aspect of human development, here's the thing that replaces the bell curve. Each and every person is a unique individual. And on this, this is one illustration of how we might think about that. We've got social, biographical, biometric attributes of a human being. And what these variables within the Venn diagram of those three circles are showing us is that these variables intersect to produce individual differences. And it's just the magnitude of that differentiates one of us from another. And so what, in a way? I mean, we can say that is true for each and every one of us. We can also say that everyone, except for me, is doing the exact same thing right now, I hope, which is listening to this talk, but each and every one of you are having a different experience of learning. So you're all sitting here, right? Looks great. But no two people in this room are experiencing the same thing at the same time, because each and every one of us is a unique individual. That's how we need to start thinking about children in our settings. And it's really helpful. This is an example of how changing thinking opens up new possibilities for practice, in part because it gives the teachers that confidence. The teachers feeling unprepared, practitioners feeling unprepared and overwhelmed. It helps them think about, you know what? This is the way it is, but I need some support here, and I need to go and seek out the expertise of a colleague that's working in social work or special needs or language or whatever to help me make sure that the children in my class together are all having a good experience of learning. So we're moving away from 20th century thinking now, and I want to stop here for a minute because I want to talk about this whole notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I want to make a argument or put it out there, and you tell me over the course of the conference, does this help us move away from 20th century thinking and into 21st century thinking? Diversity, equity, and inclusion can be read in terms of, diversity as recognizing differences, or, is that 20th century thinking, and 21st century thinking is to focus on diversity in terms of each and every person as a unique individual that is of equal worth, and that we all have dignity, that diversity is about recognizing the dignity of each human being. That equity, this notion of fairness is actually, that's okay, but it's insufficient. It's fairness based on empathy, the ability to share someone else's feelings or experiences. And I got a little glimmer that I might be onto something when at dinner last night, some of us were talking about this notion of empathy and that, the extent to which that's still, like how important that is in our work. And is that lost now with all of the pressures that we're under? And the third, inclusion, is really about the integrity, the promoting common values, that's, facilitating a sense of belonging, et cetera, but based on interdependence, because we cannot do this work alone. It privileges, I'm thinking, and this is really just in response to, this whole kind of evolution of my thinking around last century thinking, this century thinking, what replaces the old, how do we work with these ideas, but that one of the things this does is privilege the relational aspect of learning. It also privileges the ethic of care in our work. And again, that's something we know it's important, but sometimes we apologize for talking about it. We really need to be thinking in terms of foregrounding it. And now I'd like to link that to Lee Shulman, who's at Stanford, long retired now, but his work on professional learning, where he talked about professional learning as the apprenticeships of the head, the hand, and the heart. And I'm asking myself, is this a productive way to think about the complexity of our work? That these three apprenticeships of professional learning, head, hand, and heart, can they be linked, I should say, to this maybe new way or more elaborated way of thinking about DEI in terms of dignity, the head, the recognition of the inherent worth of each person, the empathy, the hand, the ability to share someone else's feelings, and what that means for not what we do, but how we do it. And the integrity, the adherence to an ethical code. I think I messed that up. I think I meant to say head, heart, hand. Sorry about that. I was going in order in my head, but my slides don't align in that same order. But I think you know what I'm talking about. It's the intersection of these things, and then, how we unravel that. So that's kind of a question I'm asking myself right now in the way I think about the projects that I support and the work that I'm doing. The other thing, and it gives me a lot of confidence going forward, is that I don't think what I'm saying is random. I think that it actually, if we look for it, it aligns with other research on learning and teaching. And in this slide, we have, and this relates to that second principle of inclusive pedagogy, that practitioners are capable, that we take what we learned from our studies on inclusion, but it's being aligned here is deeply similar, I think. Really, it's different words, but it aligns very, very nicely with work. This is coming out of the States, and it's called the science of learning. Some of you may have heard of it. But, just in that review, recent review, we are seeing real connections, where I say differences in ordinary, they say variability in human development is the norm, and so on. I know that you can all read the slide, and again, this is we've published this, so it's out there. So the practical guidance, and this, I know I've got 5 minutes left, so I'm really going to push myself here to just give you a few little practical things before I stop, is that, and this is simplified, but what we need to do in terms of thinking differently, the implication for practice is that instead of doing something different or additional for some, we think about extending what is ordinarily available to everybody so that it includes a greater diversity of learners. It's just a question that we ask ourselves as we think about how we do our work. And I truly do not restrict myself to practical work here. I think we need to think about it in terms of research design. I think we have to think about it in terms of teacher professional learning and development. How do we extend what's ordinarily together? So we do that. We focus on the what and how, not what we do, how we do it. We focus on everyone together, that notion of a sociocultural perspective on learning. And we actively, and this is just it's very straightforward, but it's just like, in my view, a missing step. We avoid the stigma of marking some as different. We ask ourselves, is there anything I'm doing here that's going to engage with the dilemma of difference or the repetition of exclusion? Yes or no? And if it's yes, well then, how do I tweak that? How do I alter that in a way that avoids that? Now this next slide is just, I'm going to pass over it only because it's an elaboration on what I just said, because I want to end with the notion of collaboration, that it's essential. I think, again, Europe has been a great site with all of the Erasmus projects and other kinds of collaborative projects that people have been able to engage in and learn from. There have been some fantastic work done in Europe around inclusion and how different national jurisdictions make sense of that over the last, at least 15 years. And I'm just going to end, just take just a minute to say that the collaborative dimension is hard work. And we can't just assume, okay, we're all going to collaborate. And I really don't want to end by saying if we all just would collaborate, everything would get better, because it's time consuming. And people are in different places. There are many sources of stress. Wait a minute, I'm sorry, did I not have that? Here we go, that's the roadmap. This is it's always going to present difficulties. And we need to develop an understanding of those difficulties as we go forward. We have to take the time out, or I shouldn't even say time out, give ourselves the time to see this as an essential aspect of our work. We have to expect tension, and I don't mean this as an excuse for anything, but imperfection is part of the process. I always say when I'm doing professional development work, you have to start somewhere. Grow your practice. Just start. It won't be perfect. You'll make mistakes. But if you adhere to the values, if you stick to this kind of principled way of approaching the work, it will follow and the practice will come. And we've had good feedback from practitioners that does indeed do things. And so, when we move from those sources of stress to professional learning, we see that, we have to be flexible, self-critical, developmental. I link that back to integrity based on interdependence. For me, that's where it goes. And so the questions are, what do I bring to the collaborative? Sorry, this is just not going where I want it to go. What do I bring to the collaborative process? New ways of thinking about human diversity, that's a question for you. A focus on how people learn and how they learn together, and alternative ways of working with specialist knowledge. Those are the questions I want you to leave here with today. And I think that will propel us, or at least it has worked for myself and some of my colleagues. And I'm going to end again with an illustration that's based on the research we did on inclusive pedagogy, but it was developed by the staff in the school that I told you about, where the parents had done the other slide about what was helpful and unhelpful. And again, I like this because it gives you a picture of the messy, complex thing that I have been describing. It's much better than anything we did in the book that we wrote about this. It was done by the people who were using the ideas and trying to make sense of them in their own practice. And so I hope that there's something in what I said that will inspire you to think about your own practice, or the contribution you want to make to the debate, or any feedback for me on some of the things that I'm thinking about where I'm trying to push myself in expanding and developing those ideas around diversity and inclusion. And thank you so much for your time.